Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Pleased to be able to welcome you, all of you, to the annual McGee Lecture at Vanderbilt University. The McGee Lecture Fund was established in 1996 by Mr. William K. McGee, Jr. to support a lecture series intended to bring outstanding economists to the Vanderbilt campus. Our speaker today, Professor Anna Aizer, continues this tradition in which the McGee Lecture Series has hosted acclaimed research economists, leading policymakers, and many of the most distinguished economists of our time. Professor Aizer is a professor of economics and public policy at Brown University. Her academic career began at Amherst College, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1991. She subsequently pursued a Master's of Science at the Harvard School of Public Health, and then completed a PhD in economics at UCLA in 2003. Subsequent to her studies at UCLA, Professor Aizer held a postdoctoral position at Princeton and then joined faculty at Brown. Professor Aizer has published widely in the areas of labor and health economics, with a particular focus on the area of child health and well-being. Her research explores the mechanisms behind intergenerational transmission of poverty, emphasizing roles played by health insurance for access to medical care, domestic violence, exposure to environmental toxins, the role of stress, and the role of the juvenile justice system. She is the author of roughly 30 published research papers, many of which have graced the pages of the profession's leading journals, including the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics, among many others. Indeed, her 2015 piece in the QJE, Juvenile Incarceration, Human Capital, and Future Crime, Evidence from Randomly Assigned Judges, won the Baird Award for Outstanding Applied Research. Professor Aizer also has an extensive record of public and professional service. Most notably, she presently serves as the co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Children's Program. She's co-editor of the Journal of Human Resources, serves on the editorial board as an editorial board member for the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and is at the same time a faculty associate at Brown University's Population Studies and Training Center, a faculty fellow at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Aizer, let's take a breath after all of that. Professor Aizer has asked that if you have clarifying questions throughout the talk, please go ahead and raise your hand, and she would be very happy to answer clarifying questions. If you have more substantive or big picture questions, please save them for the question and answer period we'll have immediately after the talk. And as such, and without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Aizer to Vanderbilt.
Very much for that kind introduction. So let's just get right to it. So the first slide, maybe many of you are very familiar with this. This is just trends in the distribution of income in the US. And it's broken down by quintile. And so what you can see starting in the late 60s, early 70s, the top quintile just kind of taking off in terms of average earnings. Fourth quintile, kind of going up. Third quintile, a little bit less. The bottom and second quintiles are seeing very little in terms of real increases in earnings over this period. And so this has led to a big increase in earnings inequality. So what does that mean for mobility, for intergenerational mobility? So this may also be a curve that you've seen before. It's been referred to as the Great Gatsby curve. What it is here is on this x-axis, this is a measure of income inequality. It's the Gini. The larger this number, the more unequal the society. On the y-axis is essentially what we call the intergenerational earnings correlation, right? So the higher that number, the stronger the correlation between the earnings of a parent and their offspring. So the larger that number, the more immobile the country. And so what you can see here is the US, very high in terms of inequality and also very high in terms of immobility, right? We're not alone. The UK and Italy are also roughly similar. If you do this for the US, and so you do this for the 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, you see an incredibly similar pattern, which is the more unequal the society, the more immobile it seems to be. What that's pointing to there, because you couldn't really see it, is Tennessee. Okay, so just so you have a sense, Tennessee is both pretty unequal and pretty immobile, as is Rhode Island. Right? Okay. Right. So just to get a sense of exactly what it means to say that a state or a country is immobile, this is basically a matrix which has the parents' income quintile, right? So these are the top earning parents, and then the child's income quintile, right? And so first means the bottom of the income distribution, fifth means the top of the income distribution. And what you can see here, for example, a parent who's at the bottom, right? That would be that yellow square there. The probability that their child is also in the bottom of the income distribution is about 42% chance. What is the chance that that child makes to the top? Only 6%. Okay. You can do the reverse. Look at the richest parents. What is the probability that their child ends up in the bottom of the income distribution? Only 9%. The chance they end up in the top, 39%. Okay, so that, sometimes that makes it a little bit more real what we really mean by immobility. Okay. Does parental income matter? Okay, to child future outcomes, including earnings as an adult? Well, it's really hard to actually isolate the impact of parental income from all the other things that is highly correlated with, right? So high earning parents are also more highly educated parents for the most part. They're often much more likely to live in two-parent households, okay? They work, their earnings are higher in part because they work more hours. So how would you know it's income as opposed to any of these other things? Why does it matter? Why am I even talking about this? It matters because the implications for policy would differ based on what we think is actually behind this immobility that we seem to observe in the US. If it's really parental education and not income, then that would suggest that income transfers to low-income families might not improve mobility very much. Right? So how would we try to sort of ascertain whether it's income or some of these other factors? What we'd really like to do is an experiment, right? We'd like to take families that are otherwise equivalent and randomly assign some to receive more income than others, and then follow their children and see what happens. That's very hard to do, but sometimes we can find natural experiments. Okay, so here's an example of a natural experiment. I undertook this work with my co-authors, Adriana Yaris-Mooney, Joe Ferry, and Sherry Eli. And what we did was we estimated the long-run impact of the first welfare program in the US. It's called the Mother's Pension Program. It first came into existence in about 1911. It was replaced in the 1930s by the Aid to Dependent Children Program, which in turn became the AFDC program, and now TANF, which is the welfare program that exists today. And what we did was we collected information on about 80,000 children whose mothers applied for the Mother's Pension Program in about 14 different states. So we sent a whole bunch of undergraduate RAs out to the different state and county archives where they went through these records and they recorded this data for us. They collected information about all the mothers who applied, and they included information on whether the mother was accepted finally or was rejected. So most of these applications went through a screening once they sort of met the screening criteria, it went before a judge who would make a decision as to whether to accept or reject their application. If their application was accepted, they would receive a pension, right? So these were mothers with dependent children. For the most part, they were widows. Okay? Some had husbands who were disabled. It was mostly widows. So what did we do? We essentially compared the long run outcomes of those children, the parents who were accepted, and compared them to the outcomes for the children whose parents were rejected, because these families look very, very, very similar on all kinds of measures. And if anything, the parents who were rejected seemed to be a little bit better off. That was in part a main reason why they were rejected, right? As they were seen as having enough resources. So we collected all this information, and what did we find? The first thing we looked at is, do the children whose mothers receive this income transfer live longer? Why do we do that? Because mortality or longevity is an incredibly good measure of health. And what do we find? You can see here the blue are the children of mothers whose applications were accepted, the red, the children of mothers whose applications were rejected. You can see that the whole distribution of longevity basically shifts to the right. They live about a year longer. All right. What else can we look at? We have two other main outcomes that we can look at is educational attainment, years of completed schooling. And here too, you see the children of accepted mothers complete more years of schooling, right? So the rejected pretty much end at 8. They don't even start high school. But you see the accepted are much more likely to have graduated from high school. Here is earnings, or log earnings, right, in 1939. So they're young adults at this time. And essentially what you see is that the children of accepted mothers earn about 14% more on average relative to the children of mothers who did not receive the pension. Okay? So here's some evidence that there is in fact a causal impact of parental income on children's long-term outcomes, right? Why does parental income matter? Well, children who grow up in resource-rich families accumulate much more skills, we'll call that human capital, and this enables them to earn more in adulthood. Human capital refers to basically everything that makes you productive as a worker. Okay? You rent your human capital to your employer. I rent my human capital to Brown, and they pay me. It's largely a function of educational attainment, health, but also some other sort of non-cognitive skills, right? Social emotional skills, management skills, etc. And you can see here, education is a big driver of the income gap, right? So that earnings distribution that I showed you on the first slide, a lot of what's behind that is gaps in educational attainment. So you can see here at the bottom, right? So these are average weekly earnings for those with less than a high school degree in the bottom. The top are those with a doctoral degree. On the right-hand side is the unemployment rate. Right? So more educated individuals are more likely to be employed and they earn more. Right? Among those who grow up poor, 21% are high school dropouts. Among the non-poor, only 6% are high school dropouts. So clearly there's a relationship between parental income and children's educational attainment, which in turn influences their earnings. Another really important predictor is health. So this is the percentage of adults who report that they are in fair or poor health. This is actually a very good marker of health. It seems very subjective, but it actually correlates pretty strongly with objective measures of health. And here you can see poor individuals are much more likely to report that they're in poor or fair health relative to richer individuals. And there's a very strong relationship between adult health and earnings. And a fair amount of evidence is suggesting it's causal. All right, what exactly does parental income buy children that they end up in better health or with more school? I'm going to go through a couple of, this is not exhaustive, but these are a couple of the things that parental income buys you. It buys you time, buys you freedom from stress. It buys better child health, buys better neighborhoods. It buys protection from pollution, and it also buys basically some freedom from interaction with the juvenile justice system. So let's kind of go through some of those. This is parental time. So the way to understand this graph here, this is the weekly number of hours that working mothers spend caring for their children. And this is defined as sort of high quality care. So this would not be me making dinner and my child on their phone. Okay? This would be interactions between the mother and the child. And this is just for working moms. And this is by years of schooling of the mother. This is all relative to mothers without a high school degree. So we consider that 0. So relative to mothers without a high school degree, those with 12 years of schooling spend about 3 more hours a week in childcare. Those with a bachelor's degree or more spend more like 6.5 more hours a week in childcare. Okay. If I were to look at, it's important to note that more educated women in this sample anyway are actually more likely to work and work more hours than less educated women. So what does that buy you? So this is, some of you may have heard of the 30 million word gap, okay, which was a very influential paper by Hart and Risley. Not quite right. The right number is more like 4 million. But what does it mean? What this means is that children of poor mothers, less educated mothers, end up hearing about 4 million fewer words spoken to them between ages 0 and 3 relative to the children of higher income, more educated mothers. So this is what this is showing you here. It's broken down by years of schooling of the mom. And this is just plotting the number of words, adult words, the number of child words spoken back, and the number of conversational terms. Why is this important? This is incredibly predictive of essentially vocabulary very early in life. Okay? These kind of pre-literacy skills. Just how important are they? This here is a plot of essentially cognitive scores of the child by age. So starting at age 3. And age 3, a cognitive score is essentially the PPVT, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. It's a measure of the child's vocabulary. That's how we measure cognition in these early years, going from 3 to 18, and it's broken down again by the educational attainment of the mother. So what do you learn from this graph here? Huge gaps already open up by age 3. And that gap is incredibly persistent, right? You see roughly similar gap at the age of 18. So these early years seem to really matter. Okay, so let's start talking about what might be going on. And I'm going to start by talking about stress or toxic stress. So poor families face many more stressful events in their lives. And we know that based on both self-reports as well as measures of cortisol, which is referred to as the stress hormone. We secrete cortisol when we are stressed. That is a natural response. It helps us to respond to the stressor. There's actually a causal evidence of a relationship between income and stress, right? So the EITC, which I'll talk about later, it's the Earned Income Tax Credit, you may have heard of it. It is essentially a transfer to low-income working families. And there's some work by Bill Evans and others basically exploiting a change in the EITC, which gave some mothers more money. And they essentially find reductions in reported stress as a function of this kind of unexpected increase in income that came through the EITC. So there's a strong relationship between income and stress. Why is stress bad? There's a lot of work in neurobiology showing that, what they refer, I'll just read it here, toxic stress, that is a child's constant exposure to high levels of stress, weakens the development of neural architecture in critical areas of a child's brain associated with learning and behavior in school. These come from animal models, right? But you can actually see that the architecture of the brain changes when a child has been repeatedly exposed to high levels of stress. So in some work that I did with Steve Buca and Laura Stroud, we looked at maternal stress and child outcomes. So there's evidence that maternal stress during pregnancy can negatively affect the developing fetus because cortisol, the stress hormone, crosses the placenta, okay? And can actually interfere with the development, the healthy development of the fetus. So it's kind of an amazing data set that from the 1950s and 60s that included measures, well, it didn't include maternal cortisol. What it had was samples of maternal blood serum that had been kept frozen in storage. And Steve Buca, my co-author, received permission to actually get some of those samples and assay them for cortisol. And so the nice thing about this data set that it has these measures of maternal cortisol when she was pregnant. And it also had measures of child IQ at age 7, as well as completed schooling at age 40 for multiple siblings born to a mom. So let's look at this. So we can look at moms that have high levels of cortisol when they were pregnant. I'll call those the high stress moms. And moms with low levels of cortisol when they were pregnant. We'll call them the low stress moms. And you can see differences when I compare across moms. The moms with high stress look kind of different. They're poor at birth, they're poor when the child is 7, and they have less completed schooling by quite a bit relative to the low stress moms. So comparing outcomes across those two sets of moms might not be a great idea. But what we can do is there's a subset of the sample where we have siblings, so 2 kids born to the same mom. So we can limit our comparison to those. And when we do that, what we see, if we look at the low stress relative to the high stress pregnancies, obviously the years of schooling are the same, because they're the same mom. But there does seem to have been some kind of stressor when the mom was pregnant. You can see this. She's got lower income when she had that. She was stressed out for one pregnancy. By the time the child is 7, the income seems to have reverted back. Okay? So what happens when we compare this child relative to this child? We find significant differences in IQ at age 7, right? So this is a difference of a little under 7 IQ points. Standard deviation in IQ is about 15, so it's pretty large. And a pretty significant difference in completed schooling. So about 11.4 years of schooling relative to almost 12.2. Does anybody know what is the return to a year of schooling as a percent? Right, 1 more years of schooling, you earn how much more in the labor market? You know? It's about 9%. Okay, annually. Right? Okay. So that's going to lead to a pretty significant difference in future earnings. There's sort of 2 channels. I think this was kind of one of the more interesting parts of the paper, by which stress disproportionately affects poor families. The first, as I already said, is poor moms, poor families face many more stressors in their lives. But the other thing is conditional on the same level of stress as measured by cortisol. In the data, it seems that stress has a much more negative impact on offspring outcomes for moms with less schooling. So it's not only that poor moms face more stressors, they are less able to buffer their children from the negative impact of that stress. So another channel is health. So disadvantaged moms and their families suffer worse health at birth. So there was a paper by Chan et al. In 2014. The US, some of you may know this, the US ranks incredibly low, 51st in terms of infant mortality rate. Our rate is comparable to that of Croatia, which is 6 per 1,000 live births, very high. But it's driven entirely, right, by moms with the lowest levels of schooling. Actually, if you look at highly educated moms, in terms of our infant mortality rate, we look incredibly similar to Austria and Finland, which have very low rates of infant mortality. So it's driven entirely by less educated moms. Okay. So the children of poor moms are born in worse health. And that relationship between family income and child health increases as the child ages. So what is this? This is family income on the x-axis. On the y-axis is basically a measure, you can think of a higher number is worse health. And so what you can see here is families with less income, their children are more likely to be in poor health. But here they've plotted how that changes by age. And in fact, the curve is flattest for the youngest kids and gets steeper for the oldest kids, telling you that the impact or the relationship between parental income and child health increases as the child ages. And poor children born in worse health continue to be characterized by worse health as they grow up. And you can see here that children who are poor are not only in worse health, but they are more likely to be hospitalized. They are more likely to die between the ages of 0 and 14. They are more likely to have elevated blood lead levels. Is it health insurance? Is that why the children of poor families are in worse health? Well, I think that's part of the story. So what you can see here, this is children without health insurance. This is the percentage of children without health insurance in 2018 and 2020. And you can see the share of children without health insurance is much lower for high income families than it is for low income families. Okay. Another thing to note is it's also much lower for those children who live in the Medicaid expansion state. So this is referring to the Affordable Care Act under Obama, where states had the option of pretty significantly expanding their Medicaid programs. Medicaid is a public health insurance program for low and middle income families now. And in states that chose to expand, right, you see many fewer children without health insurance. Right? And there's actually a long and pretty growing literature showing that these Medicaid expansions led to pretty significant improvements in birth outcomes, and that's exploiting. There were some previous Medicaid expansions in the 1980s. They improved, so expanding Medicaid to low-income pregnant women improved birth outcomes, and expanding Medicaid to low-income children improved child health. Medicaid expansions have been linked to declines in African-American mortality between the ages of 15 and 19. And they've even more recently linked these child Medicaid expansions with future adult income. Okay, so children who were living in states, low-income children living in states where Medicaid expanded, when they grow up, they in fact earn more as adults. Right. But it's not just about health insurance. So this, I think, is a very interesting study from some researchers at Dana-Farber. And they are oncologists, and they were studying children with leukemia. And they're at Dana-Farber, which is one of the major academic medical centers and really a center for really high quality treatment of individuals with cancer. And so they had a bunch of children who were in an RCT, in a clinical trial, and they were receiving the same exact treatment for a particular leukemia. So they had the same exact condition, the same leukemia, and they were receiving exactly the same care because they were in this trial. And they followed these children up to 9 years after their treatment for leukemia. It's a little bit hard to see here, but the red line is children who live in high poverty neighborhoods. And what they plotted here is a survival rate, right? So a lower survival rate means higher mortality. And what they find is that even though these kids received exactly the same care, had exactly the same condition in terms of the underlying leukemia, that children in low-income neighborhoods had lower survival rates, right? And so they were really surprised by that. As a social scientist, it's not surprising at all, right? And there's a lot of, more than one reason why, most likely, but two key things that they pointed to was that the low-income children were in worse underlying health before the leukemia. And it was a fairly complicated drug regimen. And low-income families had a harder time adhering to it strictly. Again, going back to sort of the stressors story, right? Being poor in the US is very stressful. And there's lots of things these families are juggling. So it's not terribly surprising. So it's not just about unequal access to care, even conditional on the same care, you still see differences in health. Neighborhoods, do neighborhoods matter? There is significant residential segregation in the US. Interestingly, residential segregation based on race has been declining over time, but residential segregation based on income has been increasing over time. So I think this is kind of a nice slide here. This is showing you essentially average income of neighborhoods. And so green are the most affluent, so the bright green is the most affluent neighborhoods. The bright purple is the least affluent neighborhoods. And here we're seeing, see, it's plotted from about 1970 to 2007. And in 1970, the majority of American families lived sort of in these middle income neighborhoods, kind of the lightest purple and the lightest green. But over time, what this is telling you is fewer and fewer people are living in those middle income neighborhoods, and more people are living in the extremes, the very poor or the very rich. So we're getting much more segregated. Why might neighborhoods matter? Why would that matter? Many reasons: school quality, other neighborhood resources, things like playgrounds and parks and health clinics, etc. Pollution, social capital, social interactions, violence, and contact with the criminal justice system or policing. Is there a causal impact of neighborhoods on children's health and well-being? We pick our neighborhoods, right? So it's not random where we live for the most part. So it's hard to know whether it's the neighborhood per se or something about the family that picked that neighborhood. So there was a really wonderful study called the Moving to Opportunity, or MTO study. It was an experiment implemented between 1994 and 1998. There were a little under 5,000 families at 5 sites, and families were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. The first group is called the experimental group. They received a housing voucher that they could use, Section 8 voucher. You guys know what Section 8s are. The Section 8 says you pay no more than 30% of your income in rent, and the federal government pays the rest. within some limits. But if you were in the experimental group, you could only use your housing voucher to move to a low poverty neighborhood. Then they had just a plain old Section 8 group. You got the Section 8 voucher, you could move where you want. There were no restrictions. Finally, there was a control group and you did not get any voucher. Right? These were families that were living in public housing in, for the most part, high poverty neighborhoods. So what happened when they did this? All right. So these are the children of those parents. And they were able to measure their income at age 20 through 28. And here they're comparing that experimental group with the control group. And here you can see in the very beginning, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. This is probably college going, right? So these are probably kids who are going to college, and so they have fewer earnings. But then, starting at about age 24, as people graduate from college, you start to see a big increase in earnings for those kids who grow up in low poverty neighborhoods relative to the control. So that by age 28, there's almost a $3,000 difference in annual income. Here's something that's particularly interesting. They pull out kids who moved before and after they turned 13. And all of that effect is essentially driven by the kids who moved when they were younger. I'm telling you, there's something about early life and environments that seem to really matter. I'm going to focus on two mechanisms, two reasons why neighborhoods might matter. Focus on pollution and on crime. All right, exposure to environmental toxins. Poor and minority families are much more likely to live in highly polluted neighborhoods, right? And if you ask a political scientist why that is, they'll tell you those are individuals, families that have less political capital. They have a harder time fighting, the imposition of a dump in their neighborhood. Right? Economists would say, well, that's because air quality is reflected in housing prices. Right? And so lower income families cannot afford to move to cleaner neighborhoods because those houses cost more. Right? And for sure, it's probably both. What I'm showing you here, this was actually published in the New York Times. It's based on work by Glean. This is, for those of you who are familiar with redlining and the redlining maps of the 1930s. So these were the maps that were created in the 1930s that essentially color-coded neighborhoods. And if you were in a red or, to a slightly lesser extent, a yellow neighborhood, you are high risk. And you would not be eligible for federally backed mortgages. Who lived in red areas and to a lesser extent, yellow areas? African Americans. So this is a map from the 1930s. And you see here, that kind of residential segregation persists to 2010. It is still the case in those redlined areas, but those areas are majority African American. Those also are the areas with the highest level of pollution. So these are maps of nitrogen dioxide in 2010. Okay, so clearly a very strong relationship between residential segregation and exposure to pollution. Does it matter? Well, I'm going to highlight some work by Michelle Marcus, published in 2017, and she looked at gasoline content and child health. So low-income households and minority households are much more likely to live near major roads. In 1996, California required cleaner burning gasoline. Gasoline, when it burns, emits all kinds of pollutants. In 1996, there was a regulation. So what she does is she examines what happened to basically environmental pollution and child health as measured by asthma admissions to the hospital. And she's going to compare those areas that were close to roads with areas that were slightly further away before and after the regulation in 1996 to see what happens. So let's see. So here's one pollutant, carbon monoxide, and you can see the dark circle is those neighborhoods that are near the road, and the purple, the light purple, are those that are far. And you can see after 1996, the gap in pollution starts to close, right? So that by 2000, there's no longer a gap. Here she's plotted asthma emissions for those same child asthma emissions for those same neighborhoods. And again, after 1996, you start to see some convergence. So based on that, she can essentially calculate that the California gasoline content regulation reduced childhood asthma emissions overall by about 3%, but this was largely among poor and disadvantaged, for whom the emissions rate fell by 8%. It's a pretty significant change. Right? It saved about 13 million annually in reduced hospital costs. But childhood asthma is associated with large increases in the probability of obesity in adulthood, as well as a 50% increase in school and work absenteeism. So the full savings of this regulation are likely to be far larger once you consider these long-run economic outcomes of the children who were affected. Finally, let me talk a bit about the juvenile justice system. So this comes from the UN. It's a little bit old. I think these data are about 2015. And these are rates of juvenile incarceration per 100,000 youth. This is where we are. Right? We are such an outlier. There's nothing even close to us. We are a very punishment-oriented society. All right. Which juveniles are incarcerated? Well, low-income and African-American children, and Hispanic children, I should say, are far more likely to have interactions with the juvenile justice system. Okay? So in the state of Rhode Island, children on free and reduced price lunch are 10 times more likely to end up in the juvenile detention facility in the state than a student on paid lunch. In the US, 43% of incarcerated male juveniles are African American. So a really disproportionate representation in the system. And you may say, well, maybe the rates of offending are very different across these two groups. But once you conditional on self-reports of offending, which are actually pretty accurate measures, right? So there are a lot of criminologists who sort of study the extent to which self-reports of offending are actually accurate, and they're not too bad, is what they essentially conclude. Once you conditional on self-reports of offending, poor juveniles are 3 times more likely to actually be charged. So conditional on offending, poor kids much more likely to be charged. And the same thing for Black juveniles. And so it's not just different rates of offending. Something about the way the system treats these children. And a lot of people look at this, and increasingly there's more and better evidence that there's really a lot of discrimination in the justice system at multiple points. There are many decision points in the system. There's a decision to actually charge somebody. There's a decision as to what that top charge is going to be. There's a decision about conviction, sentence, etc. And at every point, there's evidence of discrimination against poor and against children of color. And there's also the quality of the legal defense for the poor, right? So that, this comes from the American Bar Association. 3/4 basically of all public defenders have caseloads that far exceed the maximum recommended, which means that they really cannot provide their clients with a high quality defense. All right, what is the impact of having all of these kids in the juvenile justice system. There's really two barriers to trying to estimate a causal relationship. One is what we call confounding or endogeneity. There are lots of things that are different about these kids, perhaps, that are what's driving a relationship between, say, juvenile incarceration and future educational attainment or earnings. And so what you really want to do is try to isolate the impact of juvenile incarceration separate from these other things. The other thing is data, right? So even though it's far more prevalent in the US and other countries, it is still a low frequency event. So you can't use survey data for something like this. You can really only use linked administrative data. So we were able to do that. We were able to get data from Cook County in Chicago. And what we were able to link is juvenile court data with high school graduation rates and adult incarceration. Right? So for every kid in the Chicago public schools, we can see whether they have any interaction with the juvenile justice system, whether they were incarcerated, whether they completed high school, and whether they were found in the adult correctional facility before the age of 25. Right? And how are we going to sort of tease out whether or not it's the juvenile justice interaction or these other things? We're essentially going to use judges. So the judge that you see is, for the most part, randomly assigned. And some judges are much stricter than other judges. And for cases that are on the margin, not all cases. So in some cases, no matter what judge you go before, you're not going to jail. In other cases, no matter what judge you go before, you're definitely going to go to jail. But there are this group of cases in the middle where which judge you get assigned to is going to really matter. So that's what we're going to end up exploiting in our study. So the general idea is, judges have different propensities to incarcerate juveniles, and you could have two otherwise identical juveniles who are assigned to either a strict or a lenient judge. And so those two kids are going to be incarcerated in different ways. So what do we find? So let's first look at high school graduation. And this is a very conservative measure. So this is high school graduation by age of 19, and it doesn't include GED. I don't have data on that. So what do you see? Kids who had no involvement, they have a graduation rate of 40%, which is pretty low. Again, this is a conservative measure. If you include GEDs and you go out to like age 21, this would be higher. For kids who are arrested, but they weren't ever detained or incarcerated, the share who graduate from high school is about 12%. And if you're incarcerated, it's less than 1%. Okay, so these kids essentially never go back to school. Then if we look at whether they were incarcerated as an adult by the age of 25, again, no involvement, that number's around 6 or 7%. If they were arrested but not detained, it looks like it's about 27%. If they were incarcerated, it's only almost 45%. Okay, so being incarcerated as a juvenile has this clear negative long-term impact on these kids. And for the most part in the US, the vast majority of kids who are in juvenile detention facilities are poor, and they are also overwhelmingly children of color. Right. Let me just talk really quickly, because I've just been talking about sort of ways in which building skills of low-income kids can help increase mobility, but there are other sort of structural factors. So let me just take 2 slides to talk a little bit about labor market discrimination. There were 2 periods in US history when Black workers made really significant gains in both relative and absolute terms with respect to employment and wages. And those 2 periods were the 1940s and the 1960s. In the 1940s, what happened? There was a massive war production effort. Okay, so the defense production, you're building tanks and planes and uniforms and all of that stuff was about $3 trillion in federal contracts to private firms to produce all of these goods. Interestingly, if you received a contract, if you're a private firm, you received a contract to produce tanks or whatever, you had to essentially, you were obligated to not discriminate in your hiring. So this was an executive order by FDR, which stated all contracting agencies of the government of the United States shall include in all defense contracts hereafter negotiated a provision obligating the contractor not to discriminate against any worker. And actually, Bill Collins here at Vanderbilt has done a lot of work in this space, and he showed that this requirement, actually mattered. It successfully increased the number of Black workers employed in the private sector defense industry, which offered better jobs at higher wages. So outlawing discrimination seemed to really matter. So we look at that. So let me explain what this graph is here. So we look at the wages of Black men relative to white men, and we're looking at where these defense contracts were allocated. So about 140 different labor markets that received either more contracts or fewer contracts. And so we measure the contract spending as like in $1,000 per capita. So the average was about $1,500 to $2,000 per capita. So what this tells you here, we plotted the log wages of Black men, that's the solid, versus white men, which is the dotted. And you can see this is essentially the relationship between how much work production your labor market was engaged in. For every $1,000 per capita, the wages of Black workers increased by about 5%. The wages of white workers didn't increase at all, really, okay? And this persisted till about 1970 with some decline. But what we were really interested in was what happened to those kids, to the kids of those Black workers. And so what we show here, this is a high school graduation rate. And so what we've plotted it out here by the year in which they would have graduated. And again, it's this is actually boys, but it looks roughly similar for girls. And so you can see for Black boys relative to white boys, if you're graduating in these years where Black workers were seeing very large increases in their employment and earnings, their children are much more likely to graduate from high school. Right? Graduation rates for Black children at this time were around 40%. So these are pretty significant increases relative to that. Okay? So discrimination in the labor market matters too for offspring long-term outcomes. All right, I'm just going to try to wrap it up here. This is a graph showing the relationship between public spending on families as a percent of GDP for 37 OECD countries. And on the y-axis is the poverty rate for children. So what do you see? The US, very high poverty rates, very low spending relative to many other countries who spend much more and have much lower child poverty rates. Okay. Why are children treated so differently in the US? So if I did that same graph and looked at spending on the elderly, the US would be right in the middle of the pack, spending about 7% of GDP on the elderly. Okay. So why are kids treated so differently? Lots of reasons. We're going to focus on one reason, which is this concern among both policymakers and economic researchers over what we call the negative behavioral effects of cash and near cash assistance. So if you give poor moms cash without conditions of work or anything, you might be concerned that she might reduce her labor supply, not work, because once you earn over a certain amount, you're no longer eligible for cash assistance. She might delay marriage, because if you get married, that could also reduce your eligibility. And she might actually have more kids, because if you have more children, your transfer increases. And so historically, these, what we call negative incentive or behavioral effects, have been the focus of both economic research and policymakers. And so rather than expanding cash transfers, we have been ratcheting them back and putting many more conditions on receipt. However, the economic research has really evolved over time, moving away from this sort of near exclusive focus on these potential negative behavioral effects to include a focus on the benefits of cash and other safety net programs for child health and well-being. So this is some work I've done with two co-authors. And what we did was we did a lit review, and we found 242 papers examining the impact of the safety net, which consists of AFDC and TANF, that's welfare, excuse me. EITC, I mentioned that before, that's an earned income tax credit. That is actually now the major safety net program. It is a cash transfer to low-income working families. You cannot get that transfer if you are not employed. Food stamps, also known as SNAP, and the Medicaid program. Those are the major safety net programs for families in the US. And so what we did is we characterized each of these 242 papers as either focusing on negative incentive effects or focusing on estimating benefits. And what do we see? Well, I should say, each data point here refers to a decade. So these are all the papers published between 2010 and 2020. These are papers published 2000 to 2010. You can see, starting in about 2000 and going on to the present, basically a switch, right? So we're moving away from focusing on incentive effects, moving towards estimating benefits. What happened? What were the sort of the steps in this evolution? Starting in the 1990s, essentially you had economists responding to policymakers who decided we should say cut down on cash welfare, should cut down on the AFDC program. And economists saying, well, you're going to do that, but you have no idea what the impact might be on children. And so they were able to estimate essentially moms who received cash welfare when they were pregnant, their children were born healthier. They were able to do the same thing with the Medicaid program and Head Start, showing significant benefits to kids of these programs. That focus was sort of on immediate effects on the kids, right? So if I'm pregnant and I get cash welfare, my kid's born healthier. What happened in the 2000s is there was essentially an explosion of literature documented that even a shock sort of early in the child's life, either in utero or in the first couple of years, can have these long-term consequences. So being born healthier, being born higher birth weight, actually predicts earnings, education, IQ, height, all these things in adulthood, right? So that sort of happened in the 2000s. And starting in 2010, we started getting better data, which allowed us to link participation in the safety net in childhood with future adult outcomes of kids, right? So what's the upshot or the impact of all this new research? Essentially, programs that target children have very large returns, right? And they essentially pay for themselves, in contrast to policies that target adults. And it's nice work by Hendren and Aizer. And here's just two examples. So the mother's pension program that I told you about, if we only look at the impacts on moms, we do find that moms, for example, do delay getting married. By 10 years, the marriage rates are the same across the accepted and rejected. But the accepted, they delay marriage for about a year. If we only consider that, we get what's called an MVPF, which is the marginal value of public funds. Think about it as a cost-benefit analysis. It's not exactly that. But if you get a ratio that's greater than 1, it tells you that the benefits exceed the cost. If it's below 1, the cost exceeds the benefit. So if we only consider impacts on moms, the MVPF is below 1. But once we consider impacts on kids, longevity and income, the MVPF is 5.2. Right? So the benefits way exceed the costs in that case. More recent work looking at the food stamp program does the same thing. So if you just look at moms do reduce their labor supply somewhat to maintain eligibility for food stamps. It's not huge. I'll call it modest. So if you just consider that, the MVPF is below 1. But once you consider the long run benefits to kids, it's 56. It's huge. These kids are much healthier, not much more productive as adults. They complete more schooling, they earn more in adulthood, etc. All right. This is my last one. So what do we conclude for all of this, right? Poor and minority children are at a significant disadvantage in terms of skill development, which is really important, but not the only piece in terms of escaping poverty as adults. This is due in part to lower levels of parental resources available for investment in kids. There's a lot of evidence that public or community investments in children have helped close the skill gap for these disadvantaged kids. Environmental regulation, reductions in juvenile incarceration. I should have said that even though the US is an outlier, we are better than we used to be, and the trend is to continue to decline over time. So juvenile incarceration, thankfully, has been falling over time. Moreover, these public programs like Medicaid, food stamps, Head Start, the EITC, these have all been shown to have significant benefits for children in terms of their education, in terms of their health, and there are huge returns to that in the labor market. And so as economists, we can kind of continue to contribute to society's efforts to improve intergenerational mobility by generating even more knowledge and understanding of the factors needed to ensure that disadvantaged children have the same opportunities for mobility as their more advantaged counterparts. So that is the conclusion of my.
We'll now move to the Q&A portion of the talk. If you have a question, please raise your hand and Professor Aizer will call on you accordingly.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you've examined essentially what's the effect of the distance to the poverty line. So like how deep into poverty you are, like how close to the poverty line you are in your future audience.
Yeah, great question. So kids being, so I'll answer in two ways. First of all, I should say this focus on these negative incentive effects has meant that we no longer really give out unconditional cash transfers, that cash transfers now are linked to earnings and labor market participation. We did briefly do that with the child tax credit in 2021, those of you sort of following the policy debate, as part of sort of stimulus and COVID relief. The child tax credit was expanded to include very low income families. So previously you could only get the child tax credit if you had enough earnings. It was what was called a non-refundable tax credit. So only if you owed taxes in excess of some amount would you receive any of the child tax credit. For the second part of 2021, we relaxed that. So any family was eligible, you didn't have to have earnings in excess of any amount. And that's because of COVID, right? There was huge recession in the beginning of 2020 and moving into 2021. And so we didn't want to link assistance to employment. We wanted to continue that expansion in 2022, and it was essentially voted down. And one key reason Joe Manchin said specifically was he was concerned about the lack of a work requirement. And that's essentially what doomed the child tax credit and being expanded in 2022. So there's still this concern among policymakers that if you don't have a work requirement, that poor families will stop working or reduce their employment, and these programs will not be effective in moving families out of poverty. How does this relate to your question? Those families that are not attached to the labor force are the poorest families in the country, right? These are the ones in the deepest poverty, and now they are receiving very little assistance. That changed in 2021 for a brief moment, and we saw the child poverty rates fell to the lowest levels ever in 2021, okay? In large part because of this assistance, which was now available to these families in deep, deep poverty. So these are families that are not getting any assistance. These are families that are often not even in data sets, right? Because they're housing insecure, they are homeless, we're not actually even measuring them. These are clearly the families that are doing the worst, and they are now receiving the least assistance. So it's really unfortunate. And I should also say there's recent evidence from researchers at Columbia showing that the child tax credit, the expansion in 2021, did not result in a reduction in employment earnings. Okay, so all is worried that if we give poor moms cash and not require them to work, they'll stop working, actually isn't true in the data. It did not happen in 2021. Whether that will change the policy debate going forward, I don't know. But the answer to your question is, those families are the worst off, their kids are the least mobile, and they're getting no assistance, essentially. Some of them are getting food stamps, but even food stamps now, they're trying to put work requirements. That was a good question. Yeah.
I'm curious, how does the ability for mothers, like you were talking about earlier in your slides, how does their individual ability to cope with stress and regulate stress, manage it, tolerate it, is that like an important variable in this? Is that just, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So again, poverty is stressful, right? Part of the reason people are poor is there are many shocks. They lose a job, their car breaks down, their mother gets sick. It's just sort of like a constant stream of shocks. And it's incredibly stressful. And I was talking to a psychologist in Rhode Island who had this grant. And the grant was essentially to teach low-income families how to deal with stress. And he's kind of explaining it to me. And my thought is, okay, so you have these families that are facing all this stress. Rather than trying to make their life less stressful, you're just going to teach them how to deal with the stress. And his response is, we have very little money. So he said, this is all we have. This is all we can do. But yes, obviously, the first order response would be to somehow reduce stress. And that's what income shocks do through the child tax credit. There's all this evidence now that they're collecting on how do families spend money that they receive through either the EIPs, the stimulus payments, or the child tax credit. They use it to deal with things like that. They used it to fix their car. They used it, for all the kinds of things that people with more wealth are able to deal with on a regular basis. So cash really helps, right? It really, really helps deal with stress. Short of providing low-income families with cash assistance or near cash assistance, there is evidence that providing them with coping mechanisms can actually be helpful. A little bit, again, it does sort of suffer from the criticism of why don't you just deal with the stressors. But we saw from that slide with the US and international comparison, we are not a country that wants to invest in poor families. We have not shown that to be the case. And until we do, poor families will continue to be stressed. Maybe yoga will help, but how much can yoga help?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the exposure of infants to vocabulary and then the exposure to vocabulary
Yeah. Were the common scores also what?
Across
Yeah, so that was a data set that doesn't have income and only has maternal education. But maternal education is highly, highly correlated with income. So you can sort of think of that as essentially an income gradient as well. Yeah. And again, that goes back to the stress. So why is it that more educated, higher income moms can spend more time with their kids in sort of high quality childcare? It's because they're not stressed. They're not trying to do 6 million things at once. They're not dealing with their broken car. They're not dealing with their sick mom. They can focus on their child in a way that low-income families who are facing all these stresses just can't. What is the right thing when you're dealing with all those stressors? Probably the right allocation of time is to deal with those and not read to your child. I mean, what is, you have to sort of prioritize. And if you don't get your car fixed, you can't get to work. So what are you going to do? So, I mean, I think those decisions that low-income families are making are for sure rational, but they're just very constrained. Yeah. There was another question over there, yeah.
Yeah, so the data looks like assistance when children are younger seems to have increasingly large effects, like with the movie, for example. I'm curious if there's been any researcher thinking into assistance for pregnant mothers versus assistance, like, let's say, like, once they do have a children. So I'm thinking policies such as like paid family leave during pregnancy and things like that.
Yeah, so there is evidence that things like paid family leave, someone named Maya Rosen-Slater, she's at Stanford, she's done a lot of work in this space. Jenna Stearns at UC Santa Barbara has also done work in this. UC Davis, UC Davis has also done work in this space. Yes, paid parental leave does have positive impacts on the developing child. Yeah, it doesn't. What people thought it would do with increased maternal employment doesn't seem to do that, but it does seem to be good for the kids.
And then, just kind of going off of that, does that speak to some kind of like ideal age of assistance or some kind of like ideal time?
That is really a great question. So there are some people, so Jim Hackman, who's a Nobel laureate, he's really sort of pushed early really matters. Early does seem to matter, but there is also evidence that adolescence is another very important critical period of development for children. Lauren Steinberg is a psychologist at Temple, there's a lot of work in this space. And work training programs, for example, there is evidence that they can be quite effective in terms of improving, and those are geared towards adolescents. They can be quite effective at improving labor market outcomes for young kids who, coming from lower income families. So it's not just all about early, clearly it matters, but that it's not as if after that investments don't have a large return. They do, particularly in the adolescent period. And there's also work, and Jim Hackman will say this, you have to build on those early investments, right? So early investments seem to be the most productive for those kids who go, so if you look at like Head Start, there seems to be a relationship between Head Start and the quality of the schools. Head Start seems to matter, but Head Start matters even more if you go to a higher quality school afterwards, right? So there's kind of complementarities over time. So it's not just early, and after early it doesn't matter. It does matter, and it also makes those early investments more productive. Yeah.
Eventually, the relationship between mothers spend more time with their children. What about like high stress, high power consumption professions like emergency medical professionals? How did that work?
That's a great question. So those seem to be professions in which there's lots of human capital there. And it seems to be, based on the data, that those are still moms who are able to sort of come home and put things aside, right? That they don't come home and have a barrage of additional things that they need to worry about or work on. So there is something about sort of these more high professions, high skilled professions, that those tend to be, in many cases, jobs that can sort of, and workers that can sort of separate, the stress from employment with, sort of personal lives and household child rearing responsibilities. That seems to be the case. Although, there's actually work by Claudia Golden and others looking at the high Yes, exactly. So they're looking at, they've done work with like MBAs, like Harvard and Chicago MBAs, those are like well-trained professional women who tend to be married to sort of other MBAs often. And in those professions where there's sort of high return to many, many hours, so corporate law, finance, things like that, you do see women moving away from within MBAs, within Harvard and Chicago MBAs, they move away from those types of professions to professions that have more steady hours. And for sure that has to do with sort of their ability to manage households and professional lives. And so you see sort of male MBAs are much more likely to go into those kinds of jobs where you're expecting 80-hour weeks, where the return is incredibly high, these are very high paying. But women cannot move into those on average, it's not in all cases, of course. Yeah.
Why is it only in development?
Why did I say that again?
Like, why is it only linked to older stress? Is it a way to think about like the co-parenting? Yeah.
Okay. There's a couple of things. First of all, data limitations. So we usually have moms in our data. Sometimes we have dads, sometimes we don't. There is a very nice data set called the Fragile Families data set that was started sometime in the late 1990s. And that is a data set that specifically tries to include non-co-residing fathers. And so that is a very rich source of data on non-co-residing fathers. They are very involved for the most part in their children's lives, and for sure their stress matters and their income matters and their schooling matters. We rarely have them in our data sets. So that's why we have focused so much on moms in so much of our analyses, because that's who we've got. But again, there was sort of this recognition by scholars that we really should be capturing these non-co-residing dads because they are an important part of the story. And the evidence from Fragile Families is consistent with that. These dads matter. We often don't have their data. So that's really why it's more sort of data limitations. Yeah, so I think absolutely, because you only need, so the child tax credit, let's say, people have looked at the EITC, people have not looked at the child tax credit in the US, they have in Canada. If you think of it like the EITC has shown that there are significant benefits for kids in both the short run, test scores, and longer run. You only need small benefits for kids, right? So we only need to increase test scores or completed schooling by a small amount because those benefits accrue over the entire lifetime of the child. So over many years, the benefits are large, even if in a given year, they're kind of modest. So for most of these programs that show any benefits in terms of the children's outcomes, over the long run, the benefits are going to far exceed the costs. So the EITC, the child tax credit, these are programs that by and large will pay for themselves over the long run. An interesting thing is the Congressional Budget Office, they score every major piece of legislation. What is the score? The score is, they say, okay, if you pass this legislation, this is what the impact will be on the federal budget. This is what the revenues will be, this is what the outlays will be. But the CBO only goes out 10 years. So the CBO isn't going to consider these long run benefits to kids in terms of their future earnings. They're trying to do that, right? They're trying to sort of try to incorporate that. But the legislation that sort of created the CBO in their mandate only says 10 years. So that's a big part of the problem, right? So if the CBO isn't considering those benefits, the legislation is going to score differently. And policymakers are going to be less likely to do it.
Thank you very much. This concludes the formal part of our talk. I hope you'll join me again. And thank